Hello and welcome back to another episode of Data Analytics Chat, where we explore different topics in the data science and AI world with the aim to impact the audience. I'm back in Spain now and really excited for this topic today. We will explore how to turn high volume of information into data, deep insights. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Arvind Balasundaram, who is the Executive Director for Commercial Insights and Analytics at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. He has a wealth of experience in the pharma market, especially working for large organisations such as Johnson & Johnson and Sanofi. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself, Arvind?
Sure, Ben. First, I want to take the opportunity to thank you for this. I don't get to talk about data and analytics a lot, and I'm really looking forward to our chat. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
The only thing is I'd rather be in Spain doing this live with you, but some other day. So my background is I lead the insights and analytics function on the commercial side at Regeneron. We're a biotech about 45 minutes north of New York City. Our goal is to really, do good for patients and as a result do well as a company, right? So that is what we're about. My remit is I run a group of about 60 people. I have 4 domains that I oversee: customer insights, which is kind of your classic market research and that area; analytics, which includes business performance analytics and data science. I also have commercial data management and field reporting, and finally incentive compensation and alignments. So that's my group. And I'm really looking forward to kind of chatting with you about topics that are pertinent to both of us. So,
yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, before in the chat, it's a popular topic. This, I think, obviously, businesses are growing. Obviously, more data is going to evolve. And I guess even in your industry, obviously, there's always been lots of data, isn't there, in your industry? And I guess you deal with the sensitive data as well, which is
correct.
Even more, you've got to be even more cautious, I guess.
Correct, absolutely. I mean, that's why I love the subject matter we're going to talk about, right? It's very exciting because of the challenges. So I look forward to it.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So let's start straight in. So why is it important for organizations to transform large volumes of data into actionable insights then?
Yeah, so data is exactly what that says. It's just data, and large volumes of data is also just data, right? And data by itself doesn't deliver impact because it lacks kind of the meaning and the structure and the relationships that one needs to really deliver impact to a business and to get to insights, right? So I think the most important function is actually how you take that data, irrespective of whether it's a small amount of data or a large amount of data, into a more meaningful process where you can look at relationships, where you can look at correlations, you can look at causal linkages increasingly, what is the logic underlying kind of each of the bits of data, and organize it in such a way that you take that data, a couple of steps forward. You take data into kind of information. That information then over time becomes knowledge. That knowledge then delivers the wisdom, which is really the insights and impacts that any business is after, right? So I like to really think about data and analytics as a journey, as opposed to data and analytics as pieces in a flow, right? So rather than within those bits, and I'm sure I'll come back to this theme, but it is an evolution that's going on with all the change around us. So that's what I would tell you.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of good for businesses because obviously if you're looking at your past data, you can look at how to improve your decisions, and then obviously from that's going to snowball, isn't it, to improve your competitiveness, competitive advantage, revenue growth. So if you've got the right structure in place, it's not the knock-on effect, isn't it?
Yep, and I think that's why we need to kind of transform data for the reasons you're mentioning, right? Is just because it's there doesn't mean it answers the question, and sometimes, it's the wrong question. It's very easy to directly go into data and then end up addressing the wrong question, right? And so one of the things I think we need to do as analytics professionals and practitioners is think about whether we're answering the right question. Has that been formulated correctly before we kind of jump into the solution mode, which a number of us tend to do because that's how it's been in our DNA traditionally, right? So I think it's a very important point to recognize that data has to transform into insight, and that's increasingly becoming a very important piece of the journey. That's going to
Yeah,
require understanding of all the pieces involved.
yeah, definitely. I think obviously it's getting more complex. There's no lie, and like with that, I guess you can go to any direction, couldn't you? There, and this, I guess, you need to, like you said, align to what you actually the insight you want to achieve, because there's many things businesses can get sidetracked to.
Yep, and it's very easy to report a wrong finding, thinking it's insight. And that does happen a lot. It's just getting, as you know, more expensive to do deeper, higher level analytics. And so there is, in some sense, a cost dimension to not specifying your business problem correctly, because you could go down a rabbit hole, solve a problem that is the wrong solution and the wrong problem. Right. So all of that kind of has to come together to deliver impact.
Yeah, brilliant. So obviously, like we mentioned, it's not easy. I
Not
guess
at
we should
all.
say that's the
But
big.
it's still fun. So that's the important piece.
Yeah, because I think also you look at what's it the stats, that 80% of data projects fail, but I don't. Obviously, I had this conversation the other day with another leader, and he sort of said you can't actually achieve your result, can you? Obviously, you can achieve steps, but it's constantly, like you mentioned, it's constantly evolving.
Yep.
So you're constantly chasing your tail, isn't it? Really, because new things come, and
Yep.
it's a never-ending cycle.
Yep.
And
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so, what are some of the challenges you face when you've dealt with like high volumes of data, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah, so let me start with just the amount of data we're dealing with, right? So for example, in healthcare in our system, by I don't know, I'm relying on some estimates that may have changed because it's changing every minute as we speak. We're talking, terabytes and petabytes of data, right? Which many analytics people don't know what that really is, but it's an extreme amount of information that is just growing leaps and bounds. So you know 745 million floppy disks, as I tell people, right, or 1.5 million CD-ROMs is really what we're dealing with in healthcare, with about 25,000 petabytes of data. Right now, obviously, we don't touch all of it in the same stretch, but a subset of that amount is still a big amount, right? So the first thing for us is obviously the extensive amount of information that shows up. Now, it would be great if all that information showed up and just talked to each other, but that is not how it presents, right? As we know, and some of it is structured and has a definite dictionary where you can fit things in. Some of it is unstructured. In fact, 80% of it is unstructured, right? And that includes numbers that just aren't organized to be able to do anything with. But then it also includes, increasingly with social media, text inputs. It includes images, it includes audio, it includes all kinds of information that is really, as we go into AI and some of the LLMs and multimodal LLMs and all of that, and where we're going with it, all of that is going to be required to be integrated to deliver an appropriate inference, because otherwise all you're looking at is only one piece of the pie, right? So that's another challenge. And the pace at which it's coming at us is just incredible, right? And this affects me every single day on the business, as I'm sure it does other people in your audience. We're in a streaming world, right? Which means we have to have knowledge on the go. So if you envision, the analogy I always use is a funnel, and what's happened to the traditional funnel is the mouth of the funnel has really, really expanded to a great degree. So there's a lot going in, and the spout of the funnel and what's coming back has shrunk. So we have to deal with a lot more, but deliver it in a lot less time and very, very efficiently and on the go. So that is the other challenge. And finally, data, as we get into structured and unstructured, it's just by nature it's full of uncertainties, right? But the business expects you to deliver very reliable and predictable information, right? So the inherent nature of the uncertainty in the data, when you combine it with the amount of it, the speed at which it's coming, and the types of data that you're dealing with, that's a huge problem, right? So data used to be, I vaguely remember going back, and I'm dating myself, but it used to be all about detection, right? If we got 30 or 30 plus sample points, we were like really excited to do an analytics problem not very far back. But now it's a problem of not of detection and finding data. It's more a problem of curation and organizing data, and really making the decision what is the data that is really necessary to solve a business problem, right? So that is what I would tell you is the biggest challenge. And so the way you solve it is really to go and pay more attention to curation, and how that curation will require appropriate cleaning steps. How do you transform all of that clean data into usable insight to deliver impact? And that's where storytelling and those elements come in as well.
Yeah, no, I think I'll see. Again, speaking to many leaders, data quality is a massive challenge for businesses, and obviously you've had the boom last year, so it's creating more unstructured data for you. So it's
Yeah.
more work, and then I guess that's why you see the massive increase in like data engineering now. There's a lot more, obviously from my side of view, there's a lot more opportunities in that field, because before it's all about data scientists will go and create models, but actually it's got to go back a few steps to actually get the improved data quality.
Yep. And data quality, I'm so happy you brought that up, because data quality for most analytics professionals before used to be a very passive engagement, right? Because that was just assumed, and you went and started delving into the analytics process. But, and I'll come back to this at some point, but the fact that analytics is now a journey means the analytics professional needs to be as well versed and immersed in the structure of data, the environment of data, the lineage of data, and all of those components. Because if a journey is fluid and continuous, all of those dimensions matter to quality that you are going to deliver to an end user, right? So I think it's a very important point.
Yeah. And then, so what strategies would you recommend for collecting like high quality data from various sources?
Yeah, so I think a lot of so if it's primary data collection, right? So then obviously you want to be very, very alert about the sources that are giving you that information. You want to make sure that the behavior is actual real behavior. You could get stated data, for example, that sometimes, you know, as a lot of us in analytics say, you have outliers and then you have out and outliers, right? And so you want to make sure that what people are saying is actually something that is indicative of how they're going to behave, right? So primary, I think, to get good data, you can't just collect it. You've got to kind of look at it, mine it a little bit to see that, hey, does this validate some of the observed behaviors I see out there? But most of the massive data sets are in the secondary realm, right? That's where we have kind of the huge amounts of data. For example, in healthcare, a lot of our prescription data, a lot of physician behavior, all of that is massive, right? And what we really look for there, and as I'm sure they do in other industries, is that data accurate? Has that been independently verified? Is the data collection process actually sound, right? And what I mean by that is, you're never going to be able to get to the universe, right? You're going to have to go off a sample. Is that sample complete? Does it represent all of the entities you want to be looking at? Is the projection from that sample to that universe, because it's massive and could provide a lot of differences in entities, is that projection methodology itself good, right? So you don't want to roll up your sleeves and examine that the way the supplier of that data actually projected that data is accurate, because otherwise you're just using data that you're assuming is correct, and it may not hold in the sample, right? So there's that dimension. There's various aspects of accuracy in data from the point of view of the content of the data. Is the data actually, do you not have many missing values in fields? Because as we all know, that can be very problematic. and then you have to substitute values, and that kind of takes away the power of the data itself in terms of variation. So there's that whole bit. You want to look for outliers. You don't want too many outliers. You want some semblance of a distribution in your data. And even if you have very varied data, you want a strong understanding of what are the degrees of variance that that data represents, because these all become extremely important when you get to the analytics end of the spectrum. So those are the steps that we use, and we look for. What I would say is completeness of data. You want all the information that you're really looking to analyze to be present in that data set. You want consistency, right? You want the same field being exactly the same wherever it appears in the data set. We have dealt with data sometimes where the same thing is differently represented, right? This happens sometimes, but you don't want to go into an analysis without that result, right? So there are those steps that we look at that really ensure that the data is good and is really clean to be able to use it for analytics.
And also, I think obviously, because got the different types there, you've got to leverage different technologies, I guess, and then also training the team members. That's you've got to include that into the mix.
Yeah, and I think, Ben, what I would tell you, right, is I love the question you asked, right? Because as I mentioned before, all of this, the parts before the data got to the analytics practitioner, even today, used to be handled primarily as an ETL task, right, by information technology. It is now changed, right? It is very important, and I know, since you work in the talent space, this is one of the really missing skills, right? Is we need, especially as we go into machine learning and deep learning and all of that stuff, you need a very good understanding as an analytics professional, as a data scientist, of the data environment, data governance, how is data transformed, all how is data provisioned and made ready for analytics, because unless you participate actively in that process, you're pretty much captive to whatever you get, right? So I think it's a very important question that you asked, and one that doesn't really get the importance in analytics discussions even today, but I think you're going to see that changing very rapidly. It's already changing.
Yeah, no, like I said, it used to be like, was it DBA's job, wasn't it? I mean, that's even data engineering. That's completely evolved now. I mean, even like we're seeing like requirements more. I guess more sort of. Well, you've got the data aspects, BI, but then also like the software type skills coming in now as well. So I guess it's constantly evolving, isn't it? The skill sets, and obviously
Yeah.
you got to have that data knowledge, and then also software skills. It's a lot, isn't it, for someone to learn and master.
Yep, and that's why many groups, including ours in analytics, have a data management oversight function, right? Because it's akin to the kitchen and the restaurant, and then I'm sure you've heard this analogy many times, but people used to talk about IT being in the kitchen and the analytics people and stakeholders being in the restaurant, and what's really grown over time is the brokering between the kitchen and the restaurant, right? And that's the role of they're not quite data engineers, they're not quite data analytics professionals, but they've got to talk both languages and they've got to broker that conversation because of the complexity and speed with which this is coming at us, right? So it is an evolution. It's a very rapid evolution, and I think you're going to see a lot of organizations kind of getting on this bus if they're not already there.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, also then you got other things like data privacy and all that's coming.
So
It's
that's a
it's
whole other
growing. It's
point.
growing, isn't it? So
Yeah,
obviously, I guess depending on the size of your company, obviously, if you've got that investment already behind you, it's going to be a lot easier, isn't it?
yeah,
Obviously,
yeah.
for smaller companies, that's where the challenges lie. So you touched base on it. So how crucial is sort of data cleaning in the analytics process? And then what tools or methods do you use to ensure this data quality?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it goes without saying, especially for all the reasons I outlined why it's getting overwhelming to do analytics these days, that the cleansing of data is probably the most important ingredient in the exercise, right? And And there's several things you need to do, right? It's not the simpler data sets we had. It's very complex. And so the first thing I think you want to do is just have some way to make data available to someone in analytics, right? And that's easier said than done, right? Just because there's data doesn't mean it should be available as is, right? So that requires some governance aspects, which has to be overarching, right? There has to be some way in which that availability is made usable, it's made secure for privacy, other reasons, and enterprise risk, right? So, and it's becoming a very big thing with open AI and data inputs coming in from there, right? So, the data governance umbrella probably is an important step. We obviously, being in healthcare, really, spend a lot of time there, which is I see that as part of a cleaning process. Many people don't, but I think it is, right? And in terms of the inputs that you actually use in an analytics process, we test our data, right? For again, because a lot of our data comes from data providers, right? You want to proactively get ahead of, what I would call the known unknowns. For example, sometimes you have a physician, let's say, who is in one group practice, but also in another group practice, right? So you have the same physician kind of with two different numbers. If you're trying to find insights about a physician without taking into account the various domains in which they practice, or whether they have an individual practitioner office and a practice in a hospital, you need business rules to kind of integrate, what you're trying to do, right? So there's that component of cleaning which we pick up in data testing, and you want some way, because of the disconnected nature of data coming in, you want some kind of cataloging of all of those databases, which is important from a cleaning standpoint as well, because if you don't know what databases are coming in, you can link all of them, right? And if you want to link all of them, you have to start with things like unique identifiers and the whole single source of truth idea, that you want to master a data set in only one place, right? In a central place. You don't want it being mastered in multiple places. So there's all of those steps that I think used to be in the domain of IT again, but are very much now on the part of groups like commercial data management, which have to have a very very important role in talking to the analytics people who use it, as well as the IT people who load and provision it. So those are all steps I know we take. I'm also aware a lot of other organizations take the same steps as part of the data cleaning and provisioning steps.
Yes. Cool. And any particular tools you could recommend to the audience, or is it across the board?
It's really, it depends, I think, very much on the environment, the types of data. That there are a whole host of tools, Ben. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I know all the tools that even we use, because they keep changing depending on the formats.
Yeah.
But there's a variety of tools depending on the type of data that you use. The how quickly it has to be done, the frequency with which the source data comes in, all of those issues, right? And so I couldn't speak very intelligently to the exact tools, but
Yeah.
I do know there's a variety and not just a single tool. Obviously, the nirvana is data observability, and I think we have tools out there like single platforms that do all of the things, right? But even those, we're still evolving in that domain.
Yeah. Okay. Things keep changing, so you've
Yeah,
got to keep, isn't it? Like, there's no end. It's not like you've done it. It's 100 other tasks get created. I guess like with Gen AI, isn't it? It's been creating such a buzz, but I guess for people like in your game, it's probably creating a lot more headaches because you've got all this more work.
correct. And that can be a challenge with stakeholders and leaders in organizations sometimes, right? Because they see the tip of the iceberg. So that's where the Gen AI and the LLMs and all of the fancy analytics and omni-channel and attribution, all of that is on that top. But what's underneath is what we're
Yeah.
talking, right? Which
Yeah.
where the real work is, right? And an understanding of that is required.
Yeah, no, exactly. So just on about like advanced analytics there. So what's some like advanced analytic techniques that can help in extracting deep insights for like these large data assets?
So, I think it depends on the type of analytics one does. That's how I would choose to address it. it depends. Are you really trying to just assess what happened, or why it happened, which tends to be more descriptive diagnostic? Then that's primarily trying to run the analytics machine, looking at the rearview mirror, right? Those tend to be simpler, and the analytics we typically use either starts with reporting or some kind of BI tool, but then gets into some level of regressions and basic kind of what we would call business performance analytics. But then when you get into the real meat of it, in the predictive and prescriptive side, right, where you're trying to inform what is likely to happen, where you're looking through the windshield, as I allude to it, or inform the business what should be done. Then you're getting into the real meat of advanced analytics and data science, right? You get into domains like marketing mix analytics, or machine learning, deep learning type inferences, more of the data scientific type methods, and so there's a variety of them depending on where you choose to plug in. I think increasingly organizations are relying more and more on predictive and prescriptive. I would even argue COVID has done that, because the world got comfortable with yesterdays, right, and knowledge of yesterday, until COVID hit, and it just changed our parameters around, and so the whole focus on trying to be able to predict as I think become very important. And I would also tell you, advanced analytics has also evolved in the sense that decision makers are now able to live with directionality in some cases and abandon explainability for prediction, because and that's why you see, I think, the rise of machine learning and those types of methodologies. We've done that for eons in some other domains like plate tectonics, where we're very good at explaining but horrible at predicting, right? And so that's kind of the nature of the beast, even in business, as COVID informed us. And so we have to constantly juggle using advanced analytics for these two purposes. And so we use a lot of very complicated, and advanced analytics in that prediction and prescriptive space, whether it's promotional optimization, whether it's market structure and those types of analytics to understand the market, whether it's forecasting, right, and being able to predict what I would call possible futures, right, and rather than just probabilities of what might happen. you know it's shifting to possibilities of what might happen, which is a slightly different nuance when you think about it, right, which requires, again, a lot of complicated analytics to get there. But these are all examples of the evolution of data science, which kind of combines that multivariate statistics and predictive modeling, and with an understanding of technology, machine learning, and algorithmic ways of exploring data, and a business relevance. How do you bring all that together at the end of the day to make sense of what the business actually needs?
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, there's lots of different models as well out there.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, how would you integrate data from different sources to create a cohesive data set for analysis?
This is the $6 million question, Ben. Is we're in a world of connected data, right? If you don't connect the data, you're just paying for a database, right? Because data is expensive, and if you don't connect it, you're not going to get good analytics, right? You get better analytics if you link it. So it's a very important question, because that's where the value is, and it really involves taking the data streams, looking for again, universal identifiers, trying to tie that in. Sometimes you have to tokenize data for privacy reasons, right? In the sense that you got to use some kind of surrogate token to maintain the relationships, but not compromise sensitive information. There's data aggregation sometimes. For example, we deal with specialty pharmacies in the area of biologics, right? Which is a very complicated area from the point of view of data generation. And if you go into the data streams there, you can't even start analyzing it, because you've got to first aggregate that data, because it's so messy and chaotic. And by aggregation, I mean you've got to get it to a higher level of organization to even think about how you want to start analyzing, right? So there are a lot of these types of steps that I think have to take place in terms of getting it analytics ready, and so that's how we end up, either linking data sets, making sense of it. We really look for single source of truth in most cases, because you have a variety of suppliers of data. Often the analytics is all trying to predict the same thing, right? And you want to make sure that the data that you're hitting in analytics ultimately is not only linked but is saying the same thing irrespective of how you approach it, right? So that is a very important part of linkage, and it's an area that is getting it's to be its own specialized view of the world on the data side, right? Is how do you create single source of truth and central mastering of data and govern how it is used across the enterprise.
Mm. Oh, interesting. And then, obviously getting the data is challenging enough. And then, I mean, how do you effectively visualize and communicate the insights that you've derived from the last data sets to the non-technical stakeholders?
So we could spend a day on this subject, right?
So I know it's a big challenge
Entire
for a lot of
volumes have
business.
been written on this subject, but I'll throw out two quotes I often use with people, right? Is the Nobel laureate Herbert Simon, essentially said that a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, right? So a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, and I think it's a very important point, right? Which it speaks to the need for curating data that is specific to answer the question that one is tasked with, right? And it requires a discipline in this day and age to do that. The second piece is a quote from David Thoreau, and I like it because I'm also an art buff, right? I go to museums in New York City, and I keep thinking about this every time I look at a Monet or a Picasso, right? It's not what you look at; it's ultimately what you see, right? And this is fundamentally why visualization is important in analytics, right? Because visualization transforms the ability of somebody to look at data and to see a bigger picture in it, right? And that combined with curation and integration is what really leads to effective storytelling, right? And so what I try to do and what I work with my team to do often is really question, number one, is the question correct? Because you don't want a great story if the plot itself is off the rails, right? So is the question correct? And if the question is correct, what is the purpose of the narrative or the story that we're developing? Then what is the minimum amount of data we need to stay within the purpose that we're after, right? And these are all very logical steps to effective storytelling, and then closing the story with impact, right? Why should somebody listen to your story? Why should I read a novel? And so the closure is very important, and I think that's what really gets you credibility with your stakeholder, and really democratizes the analytics process and the data journey from where it starts.
Yeah. No, I think impact is the big word. Isn't it? I mean, you've got to often show value because
Yeah,
in days that's if you want to make leaps forward, you need to be doing that because you've
yeah,
got some shiny tool. It's not going to make the ROI. That's going to make an impact. It's not really going to be worthwhile, isn't it? Really, when there's maybe another way you could make such a drastic change to the business.
yep. And I think the four I's, like I say, is you start with inputs, you go into interpretability, that takes you then to insights, and the insights take you to impact, right? That is the connection really from a business stakeholder standpoint on data into analytics, right? And it's very important for us ultimately to recognize what is that higher order purpose for which we engage with data and analytics, right? And it's becoming a very big issue, as you know, with AI here, right? Interpretability, explainability, responsibility, all of them have that linkage. So this is not going to be a very easy journey, but it's a very challenging and fascinating journey that I hope a lot of the folks listening to this, as well as as I tell my young talent, I'm very envious of them because the challenges are overwhelming, but the adventure is just fascinating. That they'll be able to dabble with all of these new challenges with new technologies, and it's great, right?
Yeah. I guess obviously you said from the stakeholders' point of view, he's going to or she, sorry, will want. They've got a million one things they've got to deliver on. So you've for their time, you've got to stand out, haven't you? Really, you've got to be offering that value. Look, let's do
Correct.
this. If we do this, look, we're going to make massive change to the business because what they see is they want to see main thing is to increase profit, save or cost savings. Really, isn't it? It's efficiencies, and if to do that, you need to be showing that because if not, the budget will have to get spent elsewhere, wouldn't it?
Correct. Correct.
So,
And there's three elements I think that are important: efficiency, which speaks to the bottom line; effectiveness, which speaks to the top line; and accountability, which speaks to return on investments. And if you have a recommendation, you as a good analytics professional, you should be able to back that recommendation up with metrics and KPIs. That there's an accountability, competency that is fundamental to analytics. That is why analytics is a very objective exploration into making recommendations, right? So delivering analytics without an associated accountability is just analytics.
yeah, cool. And I think yes, especially a lot of people can get lost, like because there's so much to be done. And I think you've seen it last year with Gen AI. A lot of businesses thought Gen AIs go down that path when actually maybe like another model would have been a more cost-effective solution.
Yeah, yeah, and Gen AI, we're in the experimental phase, right?
Yeah,
We
exactly.
still got
Yeah.
ways to go there. Like, I'm very excited about, for example, synthetic data, right? Where you can synthesize actual data. Now, whether we can use it or not, obviously depends on compliance and legal regulations at enterprises. But you know, we traditionally have used things like lookalike modeling and things like that, right? Where you want to kind of go beyond your data and find future customers. Synthetic data actually allows you to get to databases without compromising sensitive information, which none of us wants to do, by going beyond a trained data set, but maintaining the patterns in that trained data set and generating new information, which increases your sample points for an analytic exercise. So there's a lot of great stuff coming down the pike on generative AI. Still early, but it's exciting nevertheless.
Yeah, cool. No, interesting times ahead.
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely.
So then, could you share an example where like whole high volume like, data analysis has led to significant like business insights or decisions?
Yeah, I'll actually pull one out from a prior life of mine where this was in the CNS space and the central nervous system space, and it's a technique called market structure analytics. It is a fairly advanced tool in analytics, and this speaks to the idea of when you are launching a product, and in this case we were launching a brand in a different dose, right? And form, right? So we had a pill that was available, but what we were looking to launch was an injection that essentially needed to be taken less frequently than the pill, right? Which and so how do you go about even exploring, like, how do you launch this? How do you impact behavior with this new option, right? And so market structure and analytics and analysis really comes from consumer packaged goods. The problem is no different than, let's say, Coke deciding to launch Cherry Coke. It asks the question: how does the market partition? Does it partition on a brand, and then underneath it the type, and in our case underneath that the specialty? For example, would a psychiatrist and a neurologist, does it matter that you first figure out what specialty they are before you go to understanding, do they use an injection or a pill? Is their preference more for a pill or an injection with their patients? Or do you actually start with the brand, and then they all gravitate to the brand, and then go to a pill or injection, and then how specialties use it? So this is an example where it has tremendous ramifications for strategy, because you don't want to go into it just looking at data without understanding how does that data and behavior organize itself. And depending on understanding that organization, you want to launch the brand appropriately so you get the optimal impact in launching into that right nesting in the market, right? So that's an example I would share with you. It's gotten more complicated now because of machine learning and XGBoost and all of these types of algorithms that can help to, classification and regression trees. We used to do it using data mining and cart and things like that. But it remains a very fascinating exercise as markets get crowded and more complicated, and highlights why analytics is integral in driving business strategy and can actually have a lot of impact.
Very interesting. And then to end, so what trends do you foresee in dealing with high volumes of information?
So I will come back to what I said earlier, right? The biggest trend, and I think not enough attention is being paid to this, is data is no longer a commodity, analytics is no longer a capability. Data and analytics are both a continuous journey. And what that means is people who have traditionally dealt with data will need to get very savvy about how analytics kind of applies itself to the streams of data we're getting. Same way, the analytics people who used to just touch what they were given will need to engage more actively in what I would call provisioning and readiness of analytics, right? So that's the first trend. The second trend is because of the overwhelming content, and I will say content rather than data because of the unstructured maturity we're getting with that data type. Curation, integration, storytelling is going to become extremely important, just like you mentioned. And I think the quality of insights is going to be more important than the quantity of finding, right? So it's going to be very important for analytics professionals to really start delivering quality insights, not just a number of discrete things that kind of stay disconnected, because it's getting impossible to for the organization to wrestle with too many things, right? The third thing I would tell you is, augmented decisions are going to become very, very important. And augmented decisions really is where AI comes in, right? Is it is no longer going to be even possible for us, with all of the overwhelming amounts of information and the very diverse nature of data we wrestle with, to either formulate the business problem without some help, or come back with an answer deeply confident without some help, right? And this is where augmented analytics is going to evolve. It is already evolving with integrated co-pilots, and where generative AI will go in. Query exploration and those tools are all really, really going to stick, because being able to understand the context of an original query and being able to generate other queries that may be pertinent to it are going to be humongously helpful to somebody who's practicing analytics, and help augment that mindset of the original question, right? So those would be, I would tell you, the three trends that I
Yeah,
think are going to be very, very important in the journey forward.
yeah, cool. I think I like your point too. I do seem like just seem like it's getting more specialised, like especially like domain, or especially in your area because you've got different regulations, etc. But it does seem like data science is getting. You need to be more like domain focused to get obviously understand the data more, because it's getting more. Obviously, it was quite technical, wasn't it, before? But I have to say, data science is getting more product alignment. So it's you've got that domain expertise. That's where you're going to excel, because you're going to be able to, I guess, provide the insights.
Correct. You've got to be in the journey to win the journey, right? And you can't be relying on products getting to you without really understanding the quality of the product getting to you. So what goes in and what comes out are related, right? As we all know. And yes, so it's going to become a dynamic journey, continuous, very quickly updating, and inference on the go. And I know that's a phrase, but when you think about it, it has tremendous ramifications for how you apply analytics to inform insights and deliver impact. And it's a very exciting journey. I'm thrilled that it's here. I think we've been waiting a long time for it to get here, but it's here, and we might
Yeah,
as well enjoy it.
yeah, lots more interesting times ahead,
Yeah,
and a lot more challenges.
absolutely,
Probably
absolutely.
a lot more headaches as well for businesses, but obviously it'd be good things.
Yep.
Good. Brilliant. Well, really appreciate your time, Arvind. It's been a great conversation, and hopefully the audience and listeners enjoy it.
Ben, thank you so much for the opportunity. I
Thank you.
really enjoyed our discussion, and I think, you know, just going back in that journey and living those moments is thrilling. And I thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk with you. And I look forward to meeting you in person sometime.
Yeah, definitely. When I'm next to the US.
Great.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Ben. Yep.
Thank you again.
Cheers. Bye.